What's up, everybody? Michael Walsh here. So, I want to talk about Khamzat Chimaev and about kind of the state of the middleweight division right now because I'm very much of two minds about it. Because, on the one hand, it's looking very promising. Chimaev has all the makings of a great champion. He was a guy who came to the UFC, fought like he was shot out of a cannon, immediately got everyone's attention, immediately had people asking, like, what's this guy's ceiling? Can he make it to the belt? Can he potentially win the belt in multiple divisions, because he was fighting at welterweight and middleweight back and forth, and he was talking about fighting for belts in multiple divisions. It was sort of like a young Darren Till. Darren Till at one point, going into his title shot against Tyron Woodley, was talking about being the first ever 3-division champion. He thought he would win at welterweight, middleweight, light heavyweight. Of course, we all know how that worked out. But Chimaev, undefeated, never fought for the belt at welterweight, but that was more of a weight cutting problem than a skill problem. And now he's up at middleweight, and he, of course, fought Dricus for the belt and won. So he's at least delivered that much so far. And Chimaev looked like a legitimate champion in the making. Chimaev, during his early run, had that look of like a young John Jones, where you're watching John Jones fight people like Ryan Bader, and you're just like, yeah, this guy, he's so talented, he's so confident, he's so skilled, he's so athletic. Like, who's going to stop him? This guy really seems destined for this. This guy is passing the eye test. He really gives you the impression of a generationally great fighter. And that's been the story of Chimaev. He's had some setbacks in the sense of, like weight misses and having some kind of odd performances where he exhausts himself after the first round. But on the whole, especially with his very comfortable win over Dricus, like, things are still looking very good. He's still young. He's still undefeated. Got plenty of time to be a reigning champion. He could do what Khabib didn't, because Khabib, of course, one of the all-time greats, but only had a few title defenses, and he retired early because of his father's death. But Chimaev, doesn't quite have as good of a resume yet. If you look at his combined middleweight and welterweight wins, it's comparable to like what Khabib had going into his title fight, for the vacant belt against Iaquinta. And again, Chimaev is young. He's undefeated. He's got time to just rack up wins. He's got time to maybe go up to light heavyweight at some point. Things are looking very bright for him. And that's cool. And he, while I was very critical of his fight against Dricus in terms of how boring it was, and I do stand by that, I do think it was a very boring fight and kind of disappointing based on what all of our expectations were based on how those two fight normally, I'm still optimistic that he'll have more exciting fights again going forward. And if he's like, if him and Merab are the two most boring UFC male champions, that's a good place to be. Because that's kind of the spot we're in now. If you were to say who are the most boring male champions, Merab would be the easy one to point to because of how rarely he finishes people. Some people, myself included, enjoy his sort of unique, high pace, like, break the opponent's will sort of approach to fighting. I enjoy it, but for many people, it's not the most exciting thing in the world, and it's certainly less exciting than like what Ilia Topuria does, or what Alex Pereira does. But again, to have Merab and Chimaev be the two most boring champions right now, that's a pretty good place to be. It's better than it was a little while ago when we had Bilal and we had Ankalaev, and it was starting to look like the UFC, both with its champions and with many of its like top contenders, it was very much trending towards that boring Caucasus region wrestling, kind of style. And at the moment, things are looking quite good. We've got Tom Aspinall finally defending his undisputed belt next week. Like, things are looking pretty good. And so that's Chimaev as a champion. And as far as his division, he's got a lot of contenders. The middleweight division is seeing a lot of turnover. It's seeing a lot of, things that could keep you excited, at least for a few years down the road, because, for a while there, it was really just the Adesanya and Whitaker show, and these kind of boring other contenders who never really seemed like they were going to be champions anyway. People like Vettori, people like Cannonier, people like Hermanson. Like, that was kind of the story of middleweight. Whereas now, with all this turnover, it's looking more like welterweight, where, at welterweight, you've got your Sean Brady's, your Shavkats, your Ian Gary's. There's a lot of promising dudes down there. And at middleweight, we've got at least 3 very legit contenders for Chimaev to fight. Because we've got Imanov, who's, good boxer, good striker, good knockout artist, kind of good all-around fighter, on a very good win streak, beating really good names, finishing people. We've got Fluffy Hernandez, who I'm most excited to see Chimaev fight. And we've got, now, Brendan Allen. And sure, he had to usurp RDR to become a legitimate contender, but that's fine. I mean, it's no different than when, Ben Rothwell was looking like he was, knocking on the door of a title shot at heavyweight, and he was getting all these good wins. He had submitted Josh Burnett. He had knocked out Alistair Overeem. And then in comes an old Junior Dos Santos, beats the shit out of him for 5 rounds, takes all his hype, fights Stipe for the belt. That's fine. That stuff happens. And I think it's particularly fine in Allen's case because Allen is a grappler. That's those of us who are interested in seeing RDR fight Chimaev, it was mostly because RDR is a good grappler. He's a physical grappler. He's good, particularly off his back, good guard, or at least, we had reason to think that, if you watch watch some of MMA Shea's videos about this, but he kind of, he was the one who brought to my attention the fact that RDR had a grappling match in one against Andre Galval, I believe, and spent a good chunk of that match off his back and working his guard and not getting it past. And it's to do that against a grappler of Galval's level is very serious, and that suggests that if you were to fight someone like Khamzat, who has shown some questionable ability to deal with legit jiu-jitsu dudes, as we saw in his fight with Burns, where he wasn't really able to pass Burns' guard. Burns was able to do stuff I think it's in round 2 where he just boots him off and he just puts his foot in his chest and just kicks him off because Khamzat can't get much going and he's just sitting on his knees and Burns' guard. And then there's that moment where Burns goes for an armbar. Khamzat decides and he said afterwards in interviews that he basically decided in that moment, fuck this, I don't like that shit. I'm just not going to grapple with him. I'm going to try to box with him. When you were seeing those kinds of things and when it was looking like RDR was this scrappy grappler with a good guard, that was an intriguing matchup. Now, we've of course lost that because RDR not only lost and won't get a title shot, but he got fatigued, he quit. He spent a huge amount of time with Allen in his guard and just couldn't do anything and just wasn't it didn't leave you optimistic that if we swapped out Khamzat for Allen in that situation that RDR was going to suddenly be doing well. But we've got Allen now, and Allen is, has always been known to be a strong jiu-jitsu guy. He put in 2 competitive matches against Fluffy Hernandez, and that is the kind of style you want to see Khamzat go against. You don't want to see Khamzat just fight strikers. If it were just a bunch of Israel Adesanya types at middleweight, you'd be like, this is just kind of too set up in Khamzat's favor. I want to see him take on tough matchups. I don't want him just to get the easy style matchup against kickboxers where he's going to effortlessly out-wrestle them. I want to see him fight people who can actually fucking grapple. Even Khabib, who people underrate as far as the quality of grapplers he fought, because he fought guys like Pat Healy and RDA and stuff like that. But some people criticize his title run against guys like McGregor and Poirier and Gaethje and say, these guys kind of sucked at grappling, relatively, and that diminishes Khabib a bit. And you wouldn't want to see the same thing happen to Khamzat. You would want to see him fight actual grapplers. And thankfully, we've got those, because we've got Fluffy and we've got Allen. Now, those are all the reasons that things are looking good, why middleweight is, looking better than it has in a very long time. That's the one side of things. But as I said at the start, I'm of 2 minds, and the other side of my head is thinking that middleweight just kind of looks like shit right now, because on the one hand, or for multiple reasons, one of which is, despite everything I just said about these contenders, none of them actually look like they'd do that well against Khamzat, because it is still middleweight, and middleweight is kind of a bad division. Middleweight, there was a golden age at middleweight, and it was probably 10 years ago. Maybe it was more 8 years ago. I'd have to double check. But there was a time where the top 10 of middleweight consisted of the the following people, and they were all at points in their career where it seemed like they were reasonable contenders, like they could get title shots, they could potentially become champions. But there was a time, again, like 8 years or so ago, where middleweight consisted of Chris Weidman, Luke Rockhold, Yoel Romero, Robert Whittaker, Lyoto Machida, Gegard Mousasi, Michael Bisping, Anderson Silva, TRT Vitor, Tim Kennedy. Like, there was a really good high point at middleweight. Jacare Souza, And ever since then, it's kind of been downhill, if we're being real. Like, of course, we had great fighters like Izzy, like Rob, like Poatan. I'm not saying skill-wise no one's ever lived up to that golden age, but it's sort of like light heavyweight. Like, light heavyweight used to be the premier division in the sport. You go back to the Chuck Liddell days and the Pride days, where you had Chuck Liddell, Tito Ortiz, Randy Couture, Kevin Randleman, Wanderlei Silva, Shogun Rua, Quentin Jackson, Ricardo Arona. That was the great division. And part of that's just a weight cutting thing because many of these people would just be modern day middleweights and welterweights. And same with some of the middleweights that I described from that golden age. Like, some of those guys are kind of welterweights, like Rob Whittaker. But in any case, middleweight since then has just not been that hot. Again, it's been mostly a couple of standout fighters and then some very underwhelming contenders. And so it's good to see the level of turnover that we've seen, but they're still looking like kind of the bad division. They're still looking like, in terms of their skills and abilities, and we saw this on Saturday, they're still looking more like they keep company with light heavyweight and heavyweight than they do keep company with featherweight, lightweight, welterweight, these better divisions where the average talent level is much higher. It's just not looking that hot. To see RDR have the kind of performance he had, where he just has a round and a half of success and then just sits in his guard going for arm bars and doing a body triangle from the bottom and just getting exhausted, that's a very bad look. And when you compare these people to each other, when you compare Allen to Imanov, Allen to RDR, Allen to Fluffy, RDR to Whittaker, Whittaker to Dricus, Whittaker to Khamzat, the MMA math is not looking that good as far as anyone really challenging Khamzat. The one I'm most interested in is Fluffy, and that's largely because of how scrappy he is and because of the just sheer relentless pace he pushes. He's sort of being billed as the middleweight Merab. So that at least has that X factor. But generally speaking, as far as the eyeball test, as far as the athleticism, as far as the technical prowess on the ground, I'm just not seeing much from these guys that makes me optimistic they're going to actually put up much more of a threat against Khamzat than did Dricus. And if they're not, then this is kind of going to get boring really quickly. And what makes it even worse, and this is where, despite all the nice things I said about Khamzat, he might actually kind of be a shitty champion. He just might not fight that often, because it'd be one thing if he was going to do the Merab thing where he's just fighting, where he's trying to fight 3-4 times a year, where he wins a fight and then immediately books another one next week. That'd be one thing. Then his fights can be dominant, they can be boring, they can be whatever, but at least if he's cranking them out every 3 months, who's going to complain? It's the sort of thing that it feels like Tom Aspinall would like to be doing. Now, unfortunately, even though now he's the undisputed champ, he still might not get the chance, because if he is going to be lined up, which I hope he is, if he is going to be lined up to fight Poatan, on the 4th of July card, then he's still going to be forced to be inactive, but at least he gets to fight Poatan on the 4th of July card. But in Khamzat's case, I don't think he wants to fight that often. I think he's likely going to be content to fight once a year, or maybe once every 10 months or so. And if that's happening, and if the fights aren't that exciting, or if they're just utterly one-sided, if they're one-sided in the way that the Dricus fight was, if it's looking like these contenders just don't have much to offer him, that is going to be lame. It'd be like if you were watching the Mighty Mouse reign when he's fighting guys like Chris Carriasso and stuff. except it's only happening once a year. That would kind of suck. And so it's very strange. And middleweight has always been a strange division, but it's a strange time because, again, to summarize and to reiterate, it's kind of awesome. We kind of have a great champion. We kind of have a champion who looks like he could be this generational great who just goes on to have a million defenses to do what other similar fighters haven't done. And it looks like he actually has like a good crop of contenders and who actually have some skill sets and some styles that could trouble him or at least offer resistance. But on the flip side, they kind of look like they suck, and they kind of look like they might not actually offer that much resistance. And it kind of looks like he's only interested in fighting them like once a year anyways, in which case this is just going to be dull and boring. His resume won't actually add up to that much over time because, it's one thing to fight several times a year, and that's how you actually rack up like 6 title defenses and things like that. But if you're just going to fight here and there, you're going to age out eventually. Like, you're just kind of wasting your prime years. You're wasting your best fighting years just sitting out and being rich because you don't have to fight that often. So we'll see what happens. All of this is subject to change. I could be saying all of this and Imanov could just go knock him out. Or I could be saying all of this and Fluffy could just go outwork him, and win. It's possible that Khamzat, kind of does what he did to Dricus, but with more resistance against Fluffy, does it for 2 rounds, is actually forced to work in a way that Dricus didn't force him to work. He gets tired the way many people thought he would have in the Dricus fight. And then boom, Allen comes on in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th and wins. That's entirely possible. And all of a sudden we're, retconning Khamzat's legacy. So, this is all just, forecasting. So take it for what it's worth. But again, I'm just, comment if you have thoughts on this, because I'm curious what everyone else has to say. Because again, I'm of 2 minds. It's kind of amazing. It's kind of looking very promising. And it kind of looks like shit.